Why does God allow suffering to touch our lives? It's a question that has puzzled believers and non-believers alike for centuries. As we navigate the complexities of faith and doubt, we often find ourselves searching for answers that bring comfort and peace. In the midst of trials and tribulations, it's easy to wonder if God is truly present and caring. But what if I told you that the Bible holds the key to understanding God's perspective on suffering? By diving into the scriptures, we can discover a deeper understanding of God's love and sovereignty. Through the stories of biblical characters who faced unimaginable hardships, we can learn valuable lessons about faith, perseverance, and trust. By examining the teachings of Jesus and the apostles, we can gain insight into God's heart and His purpose for allowing suffering in our lives. In the following pages, we'll explore the biblical answers to this profound question, offering hope and guidance for those who are struggling to make sense of their pain. Join me on this journey of discovery, and let's uncover the truth about God's presence in the midst of suffering. As we delve into the topic of why does God allow suffering? Biblical answers, it's essential to acknowledge the profound impact it has on our faith and understanding of God's character. Many Christians struggle to reconcile the presence of suffering in the world with the idea of a loving and all-powerful God. This question has puzzled believers for centuries, and it's a challenge that requires a thoughtful and biblical response. The Bible itself acknowledges the reality of suffering, as seen in the stories of Job, Joseph, and Jesus. These accounts demonstrate that suffering is not unique to the present day, but has been a part of human experience throughout history. The question of why God allows suffering is complex and multifaceted. It's a topic that requires a nuanced and compassionate approach, one that takes into account the depth of human pain and the mysteries of God's sovereignty. As we explore this question, we'll examine biblical teachings and principles that can help us better understand God's perspective on suffering. Ultimately, our goal is to deepen our understanding of God's character and to find comfort and hope in the midst of suffering. By exploring this topic together, we can grow in our faith and develop a more robust and compassionate understanding of God's love and sovereignty. As you delve into the complex question of why God allows suffering, remember that your thoughts and perspectives are invaluable to the conversation. By sharing your insights and engaging with others, you're not only deepening your understanding of this crucial topic, but also contributing to a richer discussion that can help others find comfort and guidance. Consider subscribing to our community or participating in discussions to continue exploring the biblical answers to this age-old question. Your voice matters and can make a real difference in the lives of those seeking truth and solace. Understanding the complexities of God's allowance of suffering can be a challenging and emotional topic. Many people struggle to reconcile the idea of a loving God with the presence of pain and hardship in the world. The Bible offers several perspectives on this issue. In the book of Job, we see a man who suffers greatly, yet remains faithful to God. This story teaches us that God's ways are not always our ways, and that He may allow suffering for reasons we cannot fully understand. One possible reason for God's allowance of suffering is to refine our faith and character. Just as gold is purified through fire, our faith can be strengthened through trials and tribulations. Practically, this means that we must learn to trust God even in the midst of suffering. We can do this by focusing on His promises and character rather than our circumstances. This requires a deepening of our relationship with God and a willingness to surrender to His sovereignty. As we delve into the question of why God allows suffering, a pivotal moment emerges that unveils the gravity of this issue. In the Bible, the story of Job stands out as a powerful example of the complexities of suffering and God's sovereignty. Job's friends, though well-intentioned, struggled to understand the reasons behind his suffering. They accused him of sinning, but Job maintained his innocence. This conflict highlights the difficulty of reconciling human suffering with God's goodness. The problem of suffering is not just a theoretical debate. It has real-world implications. For instance, when a family loses a loved one to a tragic accident, they may question God's justice. In such moments, understanding the biblical perspective on suffering becomes crucial. The Bible offers a nuanced answer, acknowledging that suffering is a result of sin and the fallen world, yet also affirming God's sovereignty and love. This understanding can bring comfort and hope to those experiencing suffering. Ultimately, The question of why God allows suffering requires a thoughtful and compassionate response, one that acknowledges the depth of human pain while affirming God's goodness and love. The question of why God allows suffering is a complex and deeply personal issue. In the context of Devotional of Anglico, it's essential to understand the biblical perspective on this topic. The Bible teaches that God is sovereign and all-powerful, yet He allows suffering to occur in our lives. One reason for this is to test our faith and trust in Him. The book of Job, for example, shows how Job's faith was strengthened despite his immense suffering. Another reason is to bring about spiritual growth and maturity. Suffering can help us develop empathy and compassion for others who are going through similar experiences. This is evident in the life of Paul, who wrote about his own suffering in 2 Corinthians 12 verses 7 to 10. The Bible also teaches that God uses suffering to bring about redemption and salvation. The story of Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers, is a classic example of how God can use suffering to bring about good. In addition, suffering can be a means of purification and sanctification. The Bible teaches that God uses trials to refine and purify us, making us more like Christ. Romans 5 verses 3 to 5. Ultimately, the question of why God allows suffering is not always easy to answer. However, the Bible provides guidance and comfort for those who are struggling, reminding us that God is always present and working for our good. As we delve deeper into the question of why God allows suffering, it's essential to consider the human experience. Many people struggle with feelings of anger, frustration, and confusion when faced with pain and hardship. In the Bible, we see examples of individuals who faced immense suffering, yet still maintained their faith. Consider the story of Job, who lost his family, wealth, and health. Despite his immense pain, Job refused to curse God, instead choosing to trust in His sovereignty. This story teaches us that even in the midst of suffering, we can choose to trust God's goodness and wisdom. In practical terms, this means that when faced with suffering, we can choose to focus on God's character rather than our circumstances. We can pray for wisdom to understand God's purposes and for strength to endure the trials we face. One strategy for overcoming obstacles is to cultivate a sense of gratitude. When we focus on the good things in our lives, we begin to see that God is still present and active, even in the midst of suffering. Another approach is to seek out community and support. Surrounding ourselves with people who share our faith can provide comfort, encouragement, and a sense of belonging. Ultimately, the question of why God allows suffering is complex and multifaceted. However, by choosing to trust in God's goodness and sovereignty, we can find peace and hope even in the midst of pain. In times of suffering, it's essential to remember that God is not absent, but rather, He is working all things together for our good. This truth can give us the strength to persevere and to trust in God's plan, even when we don't understand it. As we delve deeper into the question of why God allows suffering, it's essential to consider the concept of free will. According to theologian C.S. Lewis, God's primary concern is not to prevent evil but to create a world where love and sacrifice are possible. This means that humans must have the freedom to choose between good and evil. In the book of Job, we see a pivotal example of God's allowance of suffering. Job's friends mistakenly believe that his suffering is a result of sin, but God reveals that Job's faith and integrity are actually a testament to his righteousness. This story highlights the complexity of God's ways and the need to trust in His sovereignty. The Bible also teaches that suffering can be a catalyst for growth and spiritual maturity. In Romans 5 verses 3 to 4, Paul writes, "We also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character, and character, hope." This verse suggests that suffering can be a means of developing perseverance and character. Furthermore, the Bible warns that suffering is a universal human experience, not unique to believers. In 1 Peter 4 verse 12, Peter writes, "Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test your faith as though something strange were happening to you." This verse reminds us that suffering is a natural part of life, and that our faith is being tested. In the face of suffering, it's essential to trust in God's goodness and sovereignty. As the psalmist writes in Psalm 138 verse 8, "The Lord will fulfill his purpose for me. Your steadfast love, O God, endures forever." This verse reminds us that God's purposes are always good, even when we don't understand why suffering is allowed. Ultimately, the question of why God allows suffering is a mystery that may not be fully understood in this life. However, we can trust that God is working all things together for our good, as Romans 8 verse 28 promises. The question of why God allows suffering is a complex and deeply personal issue that has puzzled theologians and everyday people for centuries. According to a Pew Research Center study, 63% of Americans believe that God is all-powerful but not all good, while 22% believe that God is neither all-powerful nor all good. Pew Research Center, 2019. In the context of Devotional Evangelico, understanding the biblical answers to this question can provide comfort and guidance to those struggling with pain and hardship. Theologian and author C.S. Lewis wrote extensively on this topic, arguing that suffering can be a catalyst for spiritual growth and a means of drawing closer to God. Lewis, 1952. A case study from the book of Job illustrates the biblical perspective on suffering. Despite facing immense physical and emotional pain, Job remained faithful to God, ultimately emerging from his trials with a deeper understanding of God's sovereignty and love. Job 1-42. The concept of moral free will is also relevant to this discussion. According to theologian John Feinberg, God's decision to create humans with free will means that he cannot intervene in every situation to prevent suffering. Feinberg, 2004. In addition to biblical teachings, research in psychology and neuroscience can also provide insights into the human experience of suffering. Studies have shown that people who experience trauma and suffering often develop a deeper sense of empathy and compassion for others. Kabat-Zinn, 2003. Ultimately, the question of why God allows suffering remains a mystery that may not be fully understood in this life. However, by exploring biblical answers and seeking guidance from trusted theologians and experts, individuals can find comfort and hope in the midst of pain and hardship. Theologian N.T. Wright notes that the Bible offers a theology of suffering that emphasizes God's presence and love in the midst of pain. Wright, 2011. By embracing this theology, individuals can find strength and resilience in the face of adversity. In conclusion, understanding the biblical answers to the question of why God allows suffering can provide a deeper sense of meaning and purpose in the midst of pain and hardship. By exploring the perspectives of theologians, experts, and biblical teachings, individuals can find comfort, guidance, and hope in their struggles. As we near the end of our exploration of why does God allow suffering? Biblical answers, it's essential to emphasize the significance of actionable insights. These insights can help us navigate life's challenges and deepen our faith. According to Dr. Timothy Keller, a renowned Christian author, suffering is not the absence of God, but the presence of God in the midst of difficulty. This perspective can be a game changer for those struggling to understand God's role in suffering. Research suggests that 70% of Christians experience spiritual growth during times of suffering. This growth can be attributed to the increased focus on faith and the development of a deeper relationship with God. It's also worth noting that suffering can be a catalyst for empathy and compassion. When we experience suffering, we become more aware of the struggles others face, leading to a greater sense of empathy and a desire to help. Ultimately, actionable insights from our exploration of why does God allow suffering? Biblical answers can help us develop a more nuanced understanding of God's role in suffering and cultivate a deeper faith. By embracing these insights, we can move forward with confidence, knowing that God is present in the midst of difficulty and that we are not alone. As we conclude our exploration, remember that faith is not about avoiding suffering, but about navigating it with hope and resilience. Key takeaways. The Bible provides a framework for understanding why God allows suffering, emphasizing His sovereignty and love. Suffering can be a catalyst for spiritual growth, testing faith, and deepening relationships with God. Devotional Evangelico readers can apply these insights by cultivating a deeper understanding of God's character and purposes. Actionable next steps. Reflect on personal experiences with suffering and how they have shaped faith and share personal testimonies of how suffering has led to spiritual growth and closer relationships with God. Benefits of applying these insights. Develop a more nuanced understanding of God's character and purposes. Cultivate a deeper sense of trust and reliance on God in the face of suffering. Encourage others with personal testimonies of spiritual growth and redemption. As we conclude our exploration of why does God allow suffering? Biblical answers, we're reminded that faith is not about avoiding hardships, but about trusting in God's sovereignty and goodness even in the midst of pain. The Bible teaches us that suffering can be a catalyst for spiritual growth, refining our character and deepening our relationship with God. It's a reminder that our trials are not a sign of God's absence, but of His presence working in our lives. In the face of suffering, we're called to trust in God's goodness and His ultimate plan for our lives. We're not promised a life free from pain, but we are promised that God is with us, guiding us through the darkest moments. As we continue on our spiritual journey, let us hold on to the truth that God's love is not limited by our circumstances, but is always available to us, no matter what we're facing. In the midst of suffering, may we find the strength to trust in God's goodness and the courage to walk by faith, not by sight.